Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you for having me here today. I'm really excited to talk about some new research that is currently under review about the role of media in meta perceptions. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge my research team who I've conducted this research with. So Mohammed Rasul, he's a communication grad student at UC Davis, and he has been the driving force behind this research. We started this research really during the pandemic back in 2020, and we've just kept adding studies to it. And so he's the backbone. And then Boaz, Gila, and Nahumi are also important collaborators on this project, and were really instrumental in thinking about how this work can relate not just to American politics, but also to the Israeli context as well. So I will share more about what that means in a little bit. To start, I want to show you this flyer that was circulated by the GOP. So as you see in this flyer, it's framed as "the radical left hates you." And you can see three examples about why the radical left might hate conservatives. And now, if you're a Republican or identify as conservative and you read this, you might think to yourself, that's right. The other side does hate me. And here are three great examples of politicians from that side that suggest that we're at odds with the other side, that the other side dislikes us. Now, maybe you're liberal or a Democrat, and you read this and you say, that's not true about me or my party. This is actually what they say about us. So this assumption about what we think the other side says about us and thinks about us is called a meta-perception. We can think about it specifically on how the other side views us and whether or not they like us or they dislike us. We can also look at it more broadly and think about how the other side perceives reality. And some of my past research shows that we're actually quite wrong about what we think the other side would say about us. So, for instance, in some of my past work, we asked people to guess what they think the other side would say about them in terms of dehumanization, whether or not they think the other side would dehumanize them. And we asked them to give how much they dehumanize in return. So if you look at this figure here, this is strictly dehumanization, whether or not Republicans dehumanize their own group versus the outgroup. And you can see that there is a difference in how much humanization they attribute with their own versus the other side. And the bias is about 22 points between, again, how much they're humanizing their own group versus the other group. And this effect is actually replicated with Democrats, where we see similar levels of differences in how much they humanize both sides. But if you ask them, how much do you think the other side dehumanizes you, we actually see a pretty big difference. So when we ask Democrats, what do you think Republicans would say about your group compared to their own group? And we see that the perceived bias is actually 55 points. That there is a difference between what we think the other side would say about us versus their own group. Again, this is replicated for meta dehumanization with Republicans as well. They think that the other side is dehumanizing them. And this is quite consequential because we see that when we think the other side is dehumanizing us, we're more likely to hold anti-democratic attitudes. Other research has shown that we're more likely to support political violence against the other side. So we see when we have this erroneous perception, when we have this meta perception that we think the other side is dehumanizing us, this can lead us to have these anti-democratic attitudes. This can lead us to support political violence against the other side. Now, oftentimes when I talk about this research, I often get asked, well, what does media have to do with this? We know that there's a lot of partisan sorting happening where we might not have that much contact with the other side. And one way that we might actually have contact is through the media. And we know that the media plays a really instrumental role in misperceptions. That when we're watching our own political news sources, they might say very polarizing thing about the other side. And in some cases, it can lead to misperceptions about the outgroup, especially the political outgroup. But at the same time, we also know that media can be a powerful source to actually reduce our negative attitudes and prejudice towards the other side. So in various intervention studies that have used media in order to improve intergroup relationships, we actually see media can help correct our misperceptions and reduce negative attitudes and prejudice. So in the current research, we are curious what the relationship is between the media and meta-perceptions, between media exposure and our perceptions, but what we think the other side would say about us. And second, we were trying to discern what the psychological mechanism might be to help explain this association between media exposure and meta-perceptions. I'll focus first on the first question with two studies. And I'll present both of these studies together because they were the same thing, just in different contexts. So study one was a United States sample, which focused on looking at meta-perceptions between Democrats and Republicans, whereas the second study focused on meta-perceptions as well, but in the Israeli context, and in this case between secular Jewish Israelis and ultra-Orthodox Jewish Israelis, which are quite polarized in that context. And the first question we asked was about meta-dehumanization. So the meta-dehumanization questions were the same between both samples, but I'll give an example in the US context. So we showed the ascent of human scale, and what people saw was they're given this prompt that some people can vary in how human-like they seem according to this view. Some people seem highly evolved, whereas others seem no different than lower animals. So what do you think Republicans, if you're a Democrat, would say about your group? So as a Democrat, you would be asked this question and you'd be asked to guess what you think Republicans would say about Democrats and what you think Republicans would say about fellow Republicans. And it's a sliding scale with the highest score being the most meta-dehumanization. And it's the same question for the other party. So as a Republican, you're asked to respond what you think Democrats would say on this scale. And for the Israeli sample, similar questions, but again, asking about what the outgroup would say about the ingroup. And we also assessed media exposure. So we did this slightly differently between the United States and Israel because they're different contexts. It requires slightly different questions. In the United States context, we gave a really big list of media sources, and we asked people to rate on a scale of 1 to 7. As you can see, it varies in terms of exposure, how much you watched each of these following news sources. And we did various factors analysis afterwards, and they broke down very nicely into liberal and conservative news sources. And you can see the examples here. Similar case happened within the Israeli sample, similar measure. This time, though, it was a sliding scale of not at all to a lot of exposure. And the factor analysis indicated that it divided nicely based on secular and ultra-Orthodox media as well. Turning to the key findings from this first study, we see with exposure to liberal news, you see that on the x-axis, it's never to daily, so higher scores on this axis is more exposure to liberal news. Higher scores is greater meta-dehumanization, which, to mention, we computed meta-dehumanization as a different score between attitudes about what you think the outgroup would say about the in-group versus outgroup. So that different score, so bigger different scores indicate greater meta-dehumanization. And we see that for Republicans exposed to liberal news, as liberal news exposure increases, meta-dehumanization decreases. And we see the opposite direction for Democrats' exposure to liberal news. As their liberal news exposure increases, we see that meta-dehumanization actually gets worse, actually increases. And the opposite pattern for exposure to conservative news. As liberals or Democrats' exposure to conservative news increases, we see a decrease in meta-dehumanization, but as Republicans' exposure to conservative news increases, we actually see an increase in meta-dehumanization. We replicated these findings in Israel finding similar results. So we see that exposure to ultra-Orthodox news among secular Jewish Israelis, we see a decrease in meta-dehumanization as exposure increases. And we don't see much of an effect on the ultra-Orthodox population. Now, importantly, when we looked at secular news, we actually didn't find an effect for the ultra-Orthodox group. And this was likely because they have less exposure to secular news in general. It's quite an insular community, and they're likely not being exposed to secular news. So we didn't see an effect between, or a relationship between meta-dehumanization and secular news in that case. But we did see it for exposure to ultra-Orthodox news because the secular Jewish Israeli population does have exposure here. So we see this really interesting association between exposure to outgroup news and the reduction in meta-dehumanization. So as to say this another way, as outgroup media exposure increases, we see this reduction in negative meta dehumanization. You're less likely to think the outgroup dehumanizes you when you're exposed to their news. We then tried to look at a psychological mechanism that might explain this relationship. And one thing that we thought could explain this relationship is parasocial contact. And what this is this that when we're exposed to the outgroup via the media, we tend to develop this intimate, imagined relationship with them. As a result, we take that imagined relationship and we can relate it to the outgroup as a whole. So we might see the outgroup as a whole as more down to earth, as more respectable, as sharing more common values with us, because they are seen as likable people on the news. So we looked at the association here between parasocial contact and meta dehumanization and exposure to news. And we did this with a United States sample. We measured parasocial contact with a 13-item scale ranging from strongly disagree to strongly agree. And these are 2 sample items. So when I'm watching the outgroup, I feel as if I'm a part of this group. And then I look forward to watching the outgroup on the news. So the questions were very similar to this, trying to get at what is parasocial contact and is their relationship here. Now I'm about to present mediation models. I want to caveat that by saying, yes, there are lots of issues with mediation models, and I don't want to start a fight with anybody over these. And do know that we are looking into this further to try and determine causality. But theoretically, I propose this model to explain the relationship between meta dehumanization and exposure to outgroup news. So what we see here is we see an indirect relationship between exposure to outgroup news and meta dehumanization. And we see that this can potentially be explained by parasocial contact. And we see this both for liberal news and for conservative news. So potentially one mechanism to explain why we see this negative correlation between outgroup exposure and meta dehumanization could potentially be because of parasocial contact. We feel this closeness to the outgroup when we're watching them in the media, on the news, which makes us think that they don't dehumanize us as much. So overall conclusions from this research, we see that greater exposure to outgroup news is associated with reduced meta dehumanization. And one reason why could be because of parasocial contact. And so increasing cross-group media consumption and exposure could be an interesting and important way to reduce bias across opposing groups. It could be that if we're exposed to the other side, and this could be an easy way to expose people to the other side by turning on their news, then we might be able to improve intergroup relations and make the other side maybe not seem so scary and make them not think that they dehumanize us as much as we initially thought. And so with that, I welcome any questions. Or actually, we're holding questions. I'm holding any questions until the end, but welcome any later on. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much.